Welcome to episode 17 of our life group study on the book of Acts. We are currently in Acts chapter 10, looking at verses 1 to 28. We have said in previous episodes that the book of Acts is, if nothing else, a record of the Great Commission. It is the story of the Great Commission. And so with that in mind, I'd like you to stop your video and answer the question that you see on your screen. Why does the account of Peter and Cornelius mark a momentous turning point in the story of the Great Commission? Well, we turn for our answer to Matthew's record of what Jesus said when he gave the Great Commission in Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 to 20. And there he says, Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations," not just the Jewish nation, but all nations. That's what the Great Commission involves. It involves making disciples of all nations. And up until this point, the early church had not made disciples of the Gentiles because the apostles themselves were Jewish, and also the first converts to the faith were Jewish as well. Now, there had been a trend in the right direction through the Samaritan revival and the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch. However, although they were despised by the Jews, the Samaritans were not true Gentiles, and the case of the Ethiopian eunuch, it just appears to have been something of a once-off occurrence. Therefore, the apostles and the early church, because they were following the apostles' lead, were not taking their mission to disciple all nations very seriously yet. What would it take to change this situation? Well, let's begin by studying one of the men who played a major part in this turning point, and that is Cornelius. So if you would pause your video and read chapter 10, verses 1 to 8 again, and then list what we learn about Cornelius, and then the significance of each of those learnings. Well, we learn from the passage that Cornelius lived in Caesarea, which was a port about 50 kilometers north of Joppa, and it was named in honor of Augustus Caesar, who was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. Caesarea served as the headquarters of the Roman occupation. We also learn that Cornelius was a centurion. There's a bit of backstory to this. A Roman legion consisted of about 6,000 men. There were 10 regiments in a legion with about 600 men in each regiment. And then the centurion himself oversaw a tenth of a regiment, in other words, about 100 men. I hope my maths is correct there. So, we couldn't have a more dramatic start to this story. For a start, Cornelius is a Roman. He's an imperial occupier. He's an enemy of the Jews. But he's no ordinary Roman. He's an officer in the occupying army. He's a man of influence. And he lives at the very center of the Roman occupation, the headquarters in Caesarea. So we ask ourselves, well, what part is he going to play? And Luke is just building up the tension here in the story. Will he be an antagonist or a protagonist? Will he be a promoter or a persecutor of Christians? And then we learn that Cornelius is no ordinary Roman conqueror because he fears the God of the Jews. It says that he and all his family were devout and God-fearing. In other words, although they had not gone the whole hog and converted to Judaism, they believed in one God. And they respected the moral and ethical teachings of the Jews. The fact that Cornelius' family were devout, I think, is significant as well, because it bears testimony to his genuine example, his leadership, and his influence in his household. Evidence of Cornelius' devotion and his fear of God could be found in two things: his generosity to those in need and his regular prayer life. Isn't it interesting that these are two significant characteristics of those who fear God? We also know, for example, that he followed the Jewish practice of praying 3 times a day, because he was praying at 3 in the afternoon, which was a prescribed hour for prayer. But will Cornelius' fear of God mean anything to the God that he respects? Or is this God only for the Jews? After all, he's not a Jew, he's a Gentile. And in view of the Jewish Christians, he's the worst kind of Gentile, a Roman soldier. But amazingly, not only had Cornelius taken note of God, but God had plans for him. So let's have a look now at the way these plans are manifested through a vision. And so we're going to concentrate on Cornelius' vision. He gives him this vision. It's an incredibly specific vision. The angel gave Cornelius all the information that he would need to find Peter, even though he was staying as a visitor in a town 50 kilometers away. I mean, just stop for a moment and allow your mind to be boggled by that. Well, let's pause the video, and we're going to ask 2 questions. Why was the vision so specific? And what was the significance of the angel's words in verse 4b, where he talks about what Cornelius was doing, rising up as a memorial offering to God? Well, we notice that the angel's job was not to preach the gospel to Cornelius. That was Peter's job. So the angel served to put Cornelius in contact with Peter. And the significance of this is that God uses people and not angels to declare the gospel message to those he is calling. He uses people like you and I. He doesn't use angels necessarily. So the vision was intended to put Cornelius in touch with the person that God had handpicked to share the gospel message. Also, the way that God miraculously guided Cornelius would combine with Peter's miraculous experience to assure both of them that God was working, that he was in what was happening, that this wasn't something coming out of their own imaginations. The angel told Cornelius that his prayers and gifts to the poor had come up as a memorial offering before God. And that phrase, have come up, indicated that what Cornelius was doing was like the smoke of a sacrifice, because a memorial offering was actually a portion of grain that was burned on the altar. So it's clear, folks, because of the way Cornelius was acting, that God was already calling Cornelius, and evidence of Cornelius' response confirmed this. The significance of this is not that God needed a reminder to grab his attention, this smoke of the memorial offering, but rather it's to teach us that when God is calling someone, there will be evidence. And when we see that evidence, especially when God helps us to see it, we should work with God by coming alongside the person that God is calling. Come alongside to do what? Well, obviously, to share the gospel message, just as Peter was going to do. And this also reassured Cornelius that the God of the Jews was also the God of the Gentiles, and that God had accepted him. And so now the story progresses in verse 7, where it says, when the angel who spoke to him had gone, Cornelius called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier who was one of his attendants. So we know at least one of them was a Gentile. He told them everything that had happened and sent them to Joppa. So let's turn our attention now to the way that God prepared Peter. Once again, pause your video, read from verse 9 to 23, and then list what we learn about Peter, commenting, if possible, on the significance of what we learn. I'm sure you would have discovered these learnings, but the first one is that Peter was devoted to prayer. He also prayed 3 times a day, and on this occasion it was midday, which was a prescribed hour of prayer, just as 3 in the afternoon was when Cornelius was praying. Folks, if we're going to partner God in the Great Commission, we must be people of prayer, because God guides us through prayer. And I hope that this will be a take home for us today. We see also in verse 14 that Peter was devoted to the requirements of the Old Covenant. He had never, I think you just get the sense that he's indignant here. He's almost offended. I have never eaten anything impure and unclean. And because of this devotion, which had been hardwired into him through his upbringing and his community and his study of the law, it was going to take radical intervention and repetition. I'm sure you saw that there. The vision was given and withdrawn 3 times. Rather, not the vision, the trance. Because God needed to change his biases and his worldview. Now, you might be wondering, well, why did God challenge Peter on clean and unclean food if his ultimate goal was to talk about the issue of evangelizing Gentiles? And so I'm going to pose that very question to you on the screen, so if you could pause your video and discuss it amongst yourselves. Well, to come back to this question, I would like to explain the concepts of clean and unclean, because these things were central to the law that was given to the Jewish people by Moses. In order for people to enjoy communion with God, they had to be clean. You couldn't come into the presence of God. You couldn't experience a relationship with him unless you were clean. But they also needed to be clean in order to participate in worship with other Jewish people and even to live in community with them. If they were unclean, this affected their ability to live in community with their fellow Jewish people. And the whole point of this clean concept was to highlight that whilst we are unclean, God is clean. And therefore, someone or something is needed to make us clean before we can come into the presence of a clean God and relate to him. Now, according to the Old Covenant, the way to keep clean involved following laws that kept you from being defiled. And then there were other laws to be followed that would make you clean if you had been defiled. For example, sacrifices were offered every day to cleanse people. And that taught the people that not a day can go by without their sinfulness making them unclean. One of the ways a Jew could become unclean was by inviting a Gentile into his home or by entering the home of a Gentile. And this was because Gentiles themselves were considered unclean because they hadn't been cleansed by observing the law of Moses. You can see why this became a big obstacle to the early church, which was primarily Jewish. Now, the laws concerning clean and unclean food were particularly prominent in everyday life because everybody needs to eat, right? and we eat 3 times a day. And on this occasion, Peter was hungry and wanted something to eat. We see that in verse 10. So though he was praying, food was still very much on his mind. And therefore God decided to turn this prayer time, hungry prayer time if you like, into a teachable moment, preparing him for the imminent arrival of Cornelius' messengers. Although God wanted to teach Peter that Gentiles could also be made clean, he used food as a vehicle for the teaching. Please pause your video and answer the next question that I've posed on your screen. What evidence is there in today's passage that Peter had got what God was saying? Let's have a look at some of the evidence. Peter was malleable. He allowed God to challenge and change his beliefs. And evidence of that is found in verse 13, where it says that then Peter invited the men into the house as guests. Although the law said that Gentiles were unclean and would make a Jew and his house unclean, Peter invited the visitors in to spend the night. He actually did it. He invited them into Simon's house, which is also significant. He was making decisions that would affect Simon's cleanness before God. And this must have been just such a momentous decision for Peter, because the visitors were Gentiles, or at least one of them was, and he was a Roman soldier on top of it. So he was starting to show openness. And in fact, he'd already begun to show openness to questioning the clean and unclean laws in the light of Christ's death and resurrection. And we see evidence of that in the fact that he was prepared to stay in the house of a tanner, someone whose exposure to dead animals would have made him ritually unclean and for which he would have been despised and avoided by other Jews. Let's turn now to our take-home learnings. Before we sum up this episode, we need to answer the question, what is your take-home from this episode? Well, I'll just list some of my take-home learnings. Peter knew that the Great Commission was to disciple all nations. He knew that the Old Testament prophecies which spoke of God drawing the Gentiles into his plan, he knew of those. He was even moving in the right direction by staying with Simon the tanner, a man who would have been considered unclean. And yet it still took God's intervention, miraculous intervention, to get Peter and the church moving in the right direction. And therefore, what we learn from this is that God's intervention, God's work in the Great Commission is still essential. Further, I just love the fact that although God requires us to participate in the Great Commission, he is actually the one doing the heavy lifting. Number one, he prepares us. Number two, he prepares those that he's calling. Number three, he points us in their direction, just as he put together Peter and Cornelius. Another take home here is that we should not allow racism or prejudice to influence our perception of who is acceptable or valuable to God. Folks, this is a big one for us. We need to recognize that people of every nation, tribe, and tongue are equally valued in God's sight and are acceptable to him. And so we shouldn't allow any prejudice to affect or influence our strategies or what we do or do not do. And then lastly, prayer. It's important for us to be in a constant state of prayer and preparedness so that we don't miss the signs that God is calling someone or the signs that he's calling us to participate and in what way he's calling us to participate. So let's just tie all of this up. This account of Peter and Cornelius marks the start of a pivotal moment in the story of the Great Commission. This passage showcases a profound shift in the early church's understanding of its mission. It encouraged them to move beyond the Jewish community to include Gentiles as equal participants in God's plan to redeem all mankind. Cornelius, what a wonderful man. He exemplifies a devout Gentile who, through his fear of God and his righteous deeds, illustrates that God can call anybody and that his call transcends cultural and ethnic boundaries. This angelic vision that he received is not only a testament to his faithful heart, but also a clear indication of God's inclusive intentions. God was going to include Cornelius, and he wanted Cornelius to know that, and he wanted Peter to know that as well. Then let's turn briefly to Peter's transformation, because it's equally significant. His initial adherence to Jewish purity laws underscores the depth of his devotion, but it also highlights the rigidity that needed to be overcome for the gospel to advance. And through the vision of clean and unclean animals, God challenges Peter to reevaluate those boundaries, teaching him that what God has made clean should not be called impure by Peter. Then Peter's willingness to host Gentile visitors in his home demonstrates his openness to God's direction, and it paves the way for this momentous step in the church's mission. I love this narrative. It reminds us that God is actively at work in preparing both the messengers and the recipients of the gospel. And this interplay between divine orchestration and human obedience is a powerful call for us, folks, to remain prayerful, alert, and receptive to God's leading. And lastly, this passage challenges us to embrace the inclusive scope of the Great Commission. We need to trust in God's ability to bridge divides and to accomplish his purposes. So folks, I'm trusting that in the week ahead, we will celebrate the gospel's reach to all nations by implementing the lessons that we've learned in this episode. Thank you for joining us.